So let's switch.
Mobile games are going big. Play the official PC version of Clash.
To this demo project, and definitely so let's switch to this demo project, and definitely also feel free to try it on your own first. Definitely feel free to try it on your own first, with one important exception: you should not try to implement this color changing behavior because we're missing an important building block. So let's switch to this demo project, and definitely also feel free to try it on your own first. Definitely feel free to try it on your own first, with one important exception: you should not try to implement this color changing behavior because we're missing an important building block for that. But try adding this input field, maybe even the styling. And then also see if you can get this character count feature.
Let me try it this way, because it's just one thing. So I'm gonna do a section instead of list pairs. Yeah, that sounds right. Um, paragraph name.
It's I did mention that it is type for this type attribute, of course, out later, but to have this email address of input again on a mobile default behavior browsers, a date picker can choose button is the least have a first look at this input type. And let's start by exploring the email input. For that, I'll also give that input a name so that when it is submitted, we got an identifier which we'll be able to use on the server to extract that submitted data. And I'll just set this equal to user-email, though of course that value is up to you. I'll also add an ID to that input and use user email here, one word, without the dash, so that we can also add a label to connect that label to that input a name by exploring the email input. For that, I'll add another input here, and now I'll set the type to email. And I'll also give that input a name so that when it is submitted, we got an identifier which we'll be able to use on the server. Now, here. In the last lectures, I sometimes entered a name here, I sometimes entered anything, and if we have a look at the code, the HTML code, we see that we assigned a name, an identifier of username for this input, but that of course is just something we as a developer see. If I'm a visitor of this web page, I don't see that, and our visitors typically don't inspect that content here with the DevTools. So we want to give our visitors a hint about which kind of data should be entered here, what we're expecting as a value here. And for this, we can add labels. We can add labels with another special HTML element, and that would be the label element, which also has an opening and closing tag, and between those tags, you have your label text. We have no idea which kind of value should be entered here. In the last lectures, I sometimes entered a name here, I sometimes entered anything, and if we have a look at the code, the HTML code, we see that we assigned a name, an identifier of username for this input, but that of course is just something we as a developer see. If I'm a visitor of this web page, I don't see that, and our visitors typically don't inspect that content here. here with the DevTools. So we want to give our visitors a hint about which kind of data should be entered here, what we're expecting as a value here. And for this, we can add labels. We can add labels with another special. So we want to give our visitors a hint about which kind of data should be entered here, what we're expecting as a value here. And for this, we can add labels. We can add labels with another special HTML element, and that would be the label element, which also has an opening and closing tag, and between those tags you have your label text. So here, if we want the name of a user, we could say your name as a label. And if I save that, now that shows up above that input. And that, of course, is a very useful hint which we typically want to give to our users. However, from an accessibility perspective, we're not 100% there yet. This is visible to visitors of our website, and it's pretty clear here that this label refers to this input. Now, if we had a form with multiple inputs, it still probably would be obvious which label belongs to which input if we just have a look at the page. But if a blind user, for example, is visiting this page, it might not always be clear which label belongs to which input. And that's why you can also give your label the special for attribute. With the for attribute, you kind of connect this label to an input. And to connect it, you need to give your input an ID. Now, we do have this name identifier, but this only matters for the form submission. We need an ID attribute with any value of our choice to connect a label to that input. And here we could set ID.
Um, yeah, I wanted to rename this. Scared the fuck out of me. Damn. Dead.
Now that we added this form element, we can of course also
What the fuck? I don't know what any of that means. Any of that fucking means. No, no. Thank you. Thank you. This shit fucking loaded. That is exactly what I fucking needed. Thank you. this shit up top. Lord. What else is this blood clot one?
Feature to work that you can calculate.
yes or no with
Now that was our first event. To get a By now we know an example here, which in order to enter, and we all that's the key feature JavaScript allows us to implement or to use in our code. We can listen to all kinds of events that may occur on our website, like a user clicking on some element, or typing into an input field, or scrolling, or a bunch of other events that could occur. With JavaScript, we can listen to such events, and we can then execute code of our choice when such an event occurs. That's what we can do. Variables that are defined outside of a function, inside of a function. Instead, Now, to get started with event listeners and how that works, I want to start simple here. And I will delete this existing HTML code which we have, and instead I'll add a simple paragraph in here where I say click me. Now, this is a paragraph, not a link, not a button, just a paragraph. I will rename app.js to old-app.js and add a new app.js file, which is then still being added here to the HTML file. And it's this new file where I want to write my events code. Now, the goal is to add an event listener to this paragraph, text context, since in this case the paragraph is my and add event listener wants two main parameters, which I can also see here in event listener to it, P, which will select me the first and in this element child, since in this case the paragraph is my first element child, or as an alternative, since it's my only paragraph, with query selector P, which will select me the first and in this case only paragraph on the page. Now we got hold of that paragraph, we got access to it. Now how can we add an event listener? Well, we saw it on the slide. We can use our element and then use the special add event listener method on it. Add event listener does what the name implies. It adds an event listener to that element. Now, add event listener is a method because it's a command we send to the browser, basically telling the browser what it should do. And add event listener wants two main parameters, which I can also see here in this little helper overlay which opened up. You should be getting this. This overlay as soon as you add parentheses. If you don't get it, you can always hover over.
Okay. So that is the input. Shit.
Your method here to see more information about it again. And here we see a bunch of text, and it can be a bit hard to read this, but here, after this opening parentheses, we see our different parameters. We see that the first parameter describes the type of event in the end, and the second parameter after the comma is the listener, the code that should be executed when an event of that type occurs on that element. Now, the type actually should be a string. That's what add-event-listener expects. And here I get some auto-suggestions which automatically show me all the events I can listen to for get a bit closer to what we actually need to do. Let's add an input field next, of type text maybe, like this, and nothing else. So just a basic empty input field here. Now let's say we do want to listen to every keystroke and find out what the user entered, because ultimately that is what we need to do to solve this task later. Now definitely feel free to try this on your own first. Here's a quick pause for you to pause the video and give this a try. Did an event gather? First of all, we of course need to get access to this input element. So here I'll again add a variable, and that could be my input element. And we can again use document query selector and select the first, and in this case still only input element which we have on the screen. Now once we got hold of it, we can again add an event listener by accessing our input element and using the add event listener method here. And now the question just is, what's the name of the event we want to listen to? Now maybe you searched for events related to key. And there you find key down, key press, and key up. The difference is basically when they occur. For example, key down occurs when the key is pressed down before it's released, and therefore before the input value was registered. Key up happens thereafter. And if you use key up, you should be able to react to every keystroke and find out what the user did enter into the input. But an even better event, which you probably did not find though, is the input event. This essentially also reacts to key up events, but in addition, it also picks up things like dragging and dropping a value into the input field or pasting it into the input field. So whenever anything is inserted into this input field, this input event will fire. and therefore that is the event you typically listen to when working with input elements. Now we still need a function that can be executed when that event occurs. So again, I'll add a function. And here I just want to get the user input and then maybe log it to the console. So I'll name it retrieve user input. That could be a fitting name. Now inside of this function, I want to get access to the value the user inserted. So for example, I could create a variable here inside of this function because I will only use it in there, which I'll name entered text. And we can extract that from our input element. So from this variable, and then the question is, how do we get access to what the user entered? And that's definitely another challenge. If you never did that before, you can't know it unless you maybe console.dirt this input element and you had a look at the available properties there. Because for input elements, to get the inserted value, you can use the value property. The value property exists on input HTML element objects in JavaScript, and it holds the current value inserted into that input. So that's then my entered text, and then here I'll just console log that entered text, like this. And now we can connect this, and again, tell the browser to execute retrieve user input when that input event occurs. If I now save this, and we go back, if I type T, you'll see a T is being logged here on the right. If I type TE, we see TE, and so on. So the more I type, the more I see being logged here on the right. And I get this log with every keystroke I make. And that is how we can listen to input events on input elements, which is another very common scenario. And overall, you're hopefully getting a better feeling for how this event thing works. Now, when dealing Mathematical operations aren't everything though. We can also work with strings, so with text in our Java. Let's say Mac, the strings have been concatenated. That because we didn't add any, and that the minus and an perform a mathematical division of strings. But concatenating strings is a common task. In our running once means a value we define as a device. Just use the length methods since we have to. that you can calculate how many remaining characters we have if the maximum number of characters is 60, and then try updating this value after the input element. Now, if you try this on your own, I have one important hint. You will need to find out how many characters the user already entered, and you will be able to do this by accessing the length property on the input value you will have retrieved at some point. So dot length on that input value will give you the length, the number of characters a user entered into an input field. Definitely try all of that on your own. I'll give you a short pause to pause the video and try it on your own, and then thereafter we'll implement this together. So let's now implement this together. And for this, I'll first of all add a new demo.js file, which will contain the JavaScript code for this single right or wrong approach to doing this. So if you wrote some different HTML code and it looks and works correctly, which I'll give a class of control. The two elements are connected to 60 here. Of course, it's up to you which length you want.
Oh, wow. Fuck. Max. Like 60.
Want to choose here, but I'll go for 60. With that, by the way, if I save this, I got this input here, and I can't type more than 60 characters. If I try to do that, it just stops. It doesn't allow me to enter more than 60. But of course, that extra output, which tells me the amount of remaining characters, is missing. And that's why we want to use JavaScript for that. And speaking of that, after this input, still inside of this div, I will add a span here, a span which then actually will contain another span, and in this, and I'll give that outer. Span and ID. Of char count, because I'll use this for styling purposes later. Now, the content of this inner span is currently empty, or let's say 60. Because at the beginning, if nothing was typed yet, the remaining number of characters we can insert is 60, because that's our max length. That's why I'm adding 60 here as well. But then thereafter, outside of this span, I'll also insert some plain text, a slash, and then 60 to kind of signal the maximum number of characters. And this is not wrapped in a span, because I only need the span here for the first 60 so that I can later target this through JavaScript. In order to get hold of that content here, that text here, that 60,
So we have the value. Wait a minute. Okay, so enter text, this is the value. Yeah, I don't think this is right. Doesn't feel right. Need the inner HTML. Text. Text.
text here, I want to wrap it in an element which I can then easily select with JavaScript later, so that I then later can change the text content of that element to update this remaining characters text. The maximum number of characters will never be updated because it will never change and
have to shit some text content. Here we go. Text. Okay, so the value have the enter text value. Let enter text value or chars. Let remaining chars equal document dot query selector remaining chars dot text content equals let enter text value equal product name dot value, and then equals enter text value. Oh shit. Enter text value length. Enter text length.
then that event occurs. Get access with document for the styling or the HTML code, and therefore now we will dive into demo.js is attached, and then easily select with JavaScript later to update this remaining characters text with it at this time. Attached. A styles.css file is attached. Now definitely styles.css file, recap what's the only input field, and it's up to you to give us access to the input element. Now to get access
That element by ID.
to the remaining chars here, to this variable here, on that element I want to add an event listener, because I want to listen to every keystroke. Hence here we can use the product name input element and add an event listener as we learned it with that add event listener method. Now the event I do want to listen to here is the input event, because that will occur for every keystroke. And then that set field could be selected by ID or by type with the query selector, and should lead to this output here, output here. This now it's the only input field, and it's up to you what you prefer. I will select it by ID and get my, let's say, you can definitely this ID and get. Hence here we can use value which we need to insert here. Now before I add the, now it's a variable and access the value property, only to find out how long that entered text is. We need to find out how long it is so that we can then compare it to our maximum number of characters, which is 60. And therefore, I'll add my entered text length variable, let's say, which is my entered text. And then, I mentioned it in a little hint before, we have the length property here. Even though I'm not getting auto-suggestion, because my IDE doesn't fully understand which type of value entered text will be, but we know that it will be a string, and because of my hint, you know that on strings, you can actually get access to the length of that string with .length. As a side note, on an array, if you had an array value, you also have the .length property to find out how many items are. Are in the array. And when it comes to that, a string is treated a bit like an array because it's basically an array of characters, you could say. That's why we have the length property here. With that, we know how long the entered text is. Now we need to find out how many remaining characters we have. And that will, of course, be 60 minus the current length of the entered text. So here, maybe with an empty line in between to improve readability, I'll add a new variable, which I'll name remaining characters. And that's 60 minus entered text length. Now, if you want to get really fancy, and you definitely don't need to do that, but if we want to get really fancy, instead of using 60 here, we could actually also extract the maximum amount of allowed characters dynamically from that attribute which we set on input. So that we don't need to hard code, as it's called, the 60 here into our JavaScript code and change it whenever we change 60 here. but that we instead extract the max length from that input element so that detect. So here, maybe with an empty line in between to improve readability. Now, if you want to get really fancy, and you definitely don't see here, we could really fancy, instead of using 60 here, we could actually also extract the maximum amount of allowed characters dynamically from that attribute which we set on input, so that we don't need to hard code, as it's called, the 60 here into our JavaScript code and change it whenever we change 60 here, but that we instead extract the max length from that input element so that if we ever decide to change the allowed max length, we only need to do it here and here, but not also in the JavaScript code. And for that, we could add a new variable, also outside of the function. It doesn't matter, we can do it outside, we can do it inside. I'll do it outside, which could be named max allowed chars. And here we can reach out to the product name input element, which I selected here. And there we'll have a max length property. I also don't get auto suggestion here, but I know it because it's an input element object which we have access to. And as always, you can console dir your elements to have a look at them in the browser DevTools and see which properties are available. And there you would see that we have such a max length property, which holds the maximum amount of characters that are allowed to be entered in this input element. And with that, we can then use max allowed chars here, this variable, instead of 60 down there, to calculate our remaining characters. I hope this makes sense. Now here we are performing a mathematical operation, and hence this should give us a number in the end. It should give us the number of remaining characters that we have available. And now, as a very last step here in this function, we now need to update this value with our new remaining characters number. And that value is the value in this span here. And we already got access to this span here. So now we can reach out to remaining chars element and then set the text content of that element to our remaining characters here, like that. And that should be all we need for now. If you save that and you make that should be all we need for now. If you save that and you make sure that demo.js is linked to your index.html file, then you should now be able to reload or to go back and start typing here. And as you see, this number after the input field updates. We don't have the change in color as we go below 10. That's something we'll add later, but we got the basic functionality in place now. And this applies basically everything we learned about over the last hours, and we see now why we could use JavaScript, because dynamically updating something which we see on the page functions are a key feature of programming, not just of JavaScript. And functions are basically our own commands, which we can define as a developer, to then execute them anywhere in our code. And now it's time for our own custom function here. For this, anywhere in your code, you can add a new function by typing the function keyword. So we saw the let keyword for defining variables. Now we have the function keyword for defining functions. Why is it let and not variable? Well, it is what it is. So here we have the function keyword. And as I said, with that, we can create our own command. Hence, the next step is to give our own command a name. And that name is totally up to you. It just, again, has to follow certain rules and conventions. And these rules and conventions are the same as for variable names. However, there is an additional convention that function names should not describe what's in them, but instead what this operation does, since a function is a command that you can later reuse to perform a certain operation. Hence, function names should describe this operation. So here, I want to calculate my adult years, and hence I'll name this function calculate adult years. Now, this naming might still be a bit strange if you have never worked in programming before, but it is something you will get used to. Now, that's the name of our own function, our own command. Now, things change a bit, though. We don't use the equal sign, as we did it for variables. Instead, for functions, we now add opening and closing parentheses, and then curly braces. Opening and closing curly braces. And now, between those curly braces, we put our operation code, so the code that makes up this operation. And we can also put something between those parentheses here, but I'll come back to that later. Now, typically, you do now add a new line, so you add a line break, and you indent this here a little bit for readability's sake. You don't have to, you can write it all in one line, you also don't have to indent, but it's the common notation to use multiple lines and to indent because it will make it more readable. And in here, you can now perform the operation which you want to outsource. In my case, that's this calculation where I deduct 18 from age. Now, for this, we can copy this code and add it in this function, and now we need to do something with it here. Because like this, we perform this operation, but out of the box, this just produces a new value, which at the moment would go into the void. Now, one thing we could do here is we could store this in adult years, however, not by using let here, but without let, and actually define this adult years variable before we define this function. Maybe like this, without an initial value, which is also allowed, and then here, down there, I just assign a new value, and hence I remove let. Now, I'll come back to why I'm doing this in a second, but for the moment, let's change our code like this. Now, this function, this custom command, overrides, sets a new value to adult years, and the new value is age minus 18. So what I'm also doing down there. Now, the interesting thing about functions is that actually by defining such a function here, as we're doing it here between lines 12 and 14, does not execute the code in that function yet. When this entire JavaScript code file is being parsed and executed by the browser, once the browser reaches this line, and this entire code block, therefore, it will just memorize this function. It will learn your own custom command, so to say, but it will not execute it yet. Instead, you as a developer now have to tell the browser when this function should be executed. And we could do this here, instead of performing that operation of which I wanted to get rid of, as mentioned. And to execute a function, you repeat its name, so calculate adult years in my case, and then you add parentheses, opening and closing thereafter. And that's some syntax which might look familiar to you, because that's what we're basically doing for the alert, for this built-in command, which turns out to be a built-in function provided to you automatically by JavaScript and the browser. Here we also have a variable between those opening and closing parentheses, but I'll come back to why we have it here and not here later. For the moment here, for calculate adult years, we don't need it. And now we can also calculate adult years here instead of that operation which we had before. And now the advantage of this is that we only have this operation once in our function, and here I should also add a semicolon, and then we just call this function in the different places where we want to perform this operation. And hence, if we ever, for whatever reason, need to change the logic in this operation here, we can do it in this function instead of searching for all the different places in our code where we use this operation. Here, of course, I want to stick to the deduction though. And with all of that, if we save this and reload, we still see 14 and 27 as we did it before. But now we're utilizing our own function, our own command, for writing that code once and then using it multiple times. So that's functions. There is way more to functions than what we used up to this point. For example, you might wonder, why did I move adult years up here and so on? Now, I did that because, of course, ultimately I deleted adult years down there and replaced it with my function call. But why am I not just creating adult years here in the function, like this? Now I deleted the adult years definition outside of the function, and I'm just defining it in there. Well, let's give this a try. If we save this code, and you reload your page, you might still be getting old alerts, but if you click them away and you reload again, you will not get alerts again. And if you open the developer tools and go to the console there, you will see an error. And you should always check that console if something does not work as expected, because errors thrown by your JavaScript code will be output here in the developer tools in that console. And here we get an uncaught reference error. Adult years is not defined. That's a weird one. I mean, we are defining it here. Well, that's already a bit advanced, but it is an important concept. Here, we are creating a variable, but if you create a variable inside of a function, it's only usable in there. And that's also why it's slightly grayed out. That's Visual Studio Code's way of signaling to you that this variable is never getting used anywhere else in your code. And you might be saying, we are using it down there. Yes, but that's not the same variable, because as I just said, using let inside of a function creates a new variable, which is only usable in that function. And in that function, we never use it, which is why it's grayed out. We only assign a value, but then we never do anything else with it in there. And when we try to use it down there, we just don't find it, because outside of this function, we're never creating an adult years variable. And before I made that change, we did do that. So if I do add adult years here like this, even without an initial value, then we do define it outside of this function again. But now I still have a difference compared to the code from before. Now I still have the let keyword inside of this function. And that still has an important implication. If we save this code again, even though I added this variable outside of this function, if I reload this page, I get my alerts again here, but they show undealing with events. The browser actually automatically provides you with a certain parameter, which it passes into the function you tell the browser to execute when that event occurred. Now, when dealing with events, the browser actually automatically provides you with a certain parameter, which it passes into the function you tell the browser to execute when that event. Occur automatic. Now when dealing with events, the browser actually automatically provides you with a certain parameter, which it passes into the function you tell the browser to execute, which it passes into the function with a certain parameter, which it passes into the function you tell the browser to execute when that event occurs. For dealing with events, the browser actually automatically provides you with a certain parameter, which it passes into the function you tell the browser to execute when that event occurs.
Default parameter provided by browser, it is passed into the function when event listener occurs.
Into the function you tell the browser to execute when that event
When event listener
occurs. Passes into the function you tell the browser to execute when that event.
When event listener occurs, it executes that function. Default parameter provided by browser, it is passed into the function. When event occurs, it executes that function. That makes sense.
Event occurs. So in this function, which we plan on connecting to an event, we can accept a special parameter which will be passed in automatically by the browser for every event. So no matter to which event you might be listening to. And that's an object describing the event that occurs. So here, I'll name this parameter event. The name is up to you because it's still your function. But since I will use this function for listening to an event, the browser will provide me a value for this parameter. I can still name the parameter however I want, because when the browser executes that function behind the scenes once the event occurs, it will just set this first parameter to this event object value, no matter how the parameter was named. And we can now have a look into this event object, maybe by just console logging it here, so that we see what's inside of this automatically generated object. If I save that, and I now type a T in here, I get this event object being logged here. And if we expand it, we see we have a couple of properties in there. Now, this is now not an HTML element object. Instead, it's an automatically generated object that contains a bunch of properties describing the event that occurred. It actually also contains a couple of methods, which we don't see here, and which we don't need right now. Now, what we can see in here are a couple of strange-sounding properties, which are a bit more advanced. But we, for example, also see this data property, which conveniently actually contains data that belongs to this event. And which event carries which data, and if it carries any data at all, does depend on which event you're listening to. So no matter which event you are listening to, you will always get an event object automatically, but the content of that object will depend on the kind of event. And for an input event, you, for example, get this data property that carries the input value the user provided. Another very useful property we got in there is this target property. That holds the HTML element object on which this event occurred. So in this case, the input element. And this is the exact same element as we stored here in this variable, so which we selected with query selector input. That's the exact same element object which we also get access to through this target property on this event object which we get automatically. And since that's the case, we got two alternatives for retrieving that value. We can still use that variable because we will still need to get access to this variable anyways because we need it to add the event listener. But inside of this function, which is executed because of an event, we actually also could alternatively get access to our entered text here by instead using event.target, which is also our input element as I showed you, .value. So this is our input element, and therefore it still has this value property. And hence, if I do that and I temporarily comment out this event console log, then you will still see that with every keystroke, the current input is being output here on the right. Now, one very important word about this data property, which I also show you. If I do actually use event.data for getting the input, you will see that there is an important difference. Event target value, or input element value, always gave us the full value that is currently stored in this input element, so the complete word or sentence. With event data, instead, as you see as I type here, I just get the concrete character or the concrete input that was inserted with that last input event emission. And that, therefore, is a different behavior, which sometimes might be what you're looking for, but very often it's not what you're looking for. So here, see on the page and reacting to certain events. Here, this is different. It's doing a character or the concrete input that instead, as you or a sentence, always gave us the full for getting the input is being output. Do that, and I temporarily comment out this event console log. Then target, which is also our input element as I showed you, .value. Entered text here by instead using event.target, which is anyways because we needed to add the event listener. But inside of this function, which is executed because of an event, we actually also could alternatively get access to our entered text here by instead using event.target, which is also our input element as I showed you, .value. So this is our input element, and therefore it still has this value property. And hence, if I do that and I temporarily comment out this event console log, then you will still see that with every keystroke, the current input is being output here on the right. Now, one very important word about this data property, which I also show you. If I do this output here on the right, you'll see that with every key out, this is also input element as I showed you, .value. But inside of this function, we need this target same element object, which we also get access to through this target variable. So which we selected with query selector input, query to through that value. We can still, because we will, but get access to here, get value. So this is element and therefore value property. Element and therefore it still has this value property. And hence, if I do that and I temporarily comment out this event console log, then you will still see that with every keystroke, the current input is being output here on the right. Now, one very important word about this data property, which I also show you. If I do actually use event.data for getting the input, you will see that there is an important difference. event target value or input element value always gave us